The Great Philadelphia Convention was held in 1787 to address the problems of governing the United States of America, which was then operating under the Articles of Confederation. In this historic convention, under the leadership of George Washington, the Constitution of the United States was drafted in order to protect the individual states against federal infringement of liberty. In doing so, the states had to agree to part with some of their powers to the federal center.
Though the states agreed to part with some of their powers to the center, but they did it grudgingly. And since then, there was a lot of tussle between the center and the state, and between the state and the state. And a lot of unresolved problems remained, constitutional problems remained to be solved by somebody who would become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. That was a very important position, and a very capable man was wanted to do that job. So it was very important to find out a person who would really act as the umpire between state rights and federal rights. Right choice was essential. And when John Marshall was chosen the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court,
John Marshall was born in a log cabin near Germantown, a rural community on the Virginia frontier, on September 24, 1755, to Thomas Marshall and Mary Randolph Keith. He was a contemporary of the third president, Thomas Jefferson. As sources have it, they were third cousins, once removed, and both descended from William Randolph of Turkey Island, one of the first settlers in Virginia. Both of them went into the same school and to the same college before they landed in politics. During the Revolutionary War, 1777-78, John Marshall served in the Continental Army. He was the first student at the Chair of Law in the United States, established at the William and Mary College in 1779 under Chancellor Wythe Baldwin. In the year 1780, he was admitted to the bar in Richmond, Virginia, and started practicing law. In the year 1788, John Marshall served as a delegate to the Virginia Convention, called to ratify the U.S. Constitution. In the year 1800, the Senate confirmed him as President Adams' Secretary of State. Then, from 1801 to 1835, John Marshall served as Chief Justice of the United States. He died in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on July 6, 1835. Leading the Supreme Court of the United States was the most important work of John Marshall's life. President Adams had first offered the seat to ex-Chief Justice John Jay to replace Oliver Ellsworth as Chief Justice. But John Jay declined the offer on the grounds that the court lacked energy, weight, and dignity. Then, on January 20, 1801, President Adams nominated John Marshall, and he was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate on January 27th and took office on February 4th. John Marshall served as Chief Justice of the United States from February 4th, 1801 until his death in 1835. Describing the complexity of this situation, Professor Palit comments,
John Marshall was made the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court under the new Constitution. Those were stormy days because the states were grudging the diminution of their rights to the center, and there was a frequent tussle between federal rights and state rights. an umpire was needed to settle the contest. The state of anarchy was visible. States were fighting the states all the time over petty issues. The nation had not really become broad-minded. There was no nationalism born as yet. Parochialism was the order of the day. States were very selfish, very parochial, very selfish, and their whole attempt was to dribble out more concessions from the center and more territory, more property, more power from the neighboring states. Be it some trade rights, be it navigation of a natural frontier of a river, like in the case of Potomac or Hudson. So over these issues, or construction of a road, suppose, from one state to another, which can be called interstate road. In all these things, the national interest, the federal interest was given up, and the states were fighting tooth and nail to carve out as much fortune to their own state. And they had very little consideration for America as a nation, very little consideration for some federal steps to be taken in the matter, in dissolving this conflict of resolutions. So they thought that the federal government that they had created at Philadelphia was actually their enemy. But this was the prevailing notion. But John Marshall tried to show that it was not actually an enemy. It only wanted to assure the national objective, the federal objective, which would not infringe upon state rights. There could be conflict resolution, happy reconciliation of federal rights with state rights. So nobody would be deprived ultimately. So he wanted to convince that. And therefore he went on asserting in his 35 years of tenure, he went on to assert the role of the Supreme Court and interpret the Constitution in such a way that he became the custodian of the Constitution. His word was law virtually. And the way he gave the twists and turns to the phrases of the Constitution, he could claim so much power to the federal government and to the Supreme Court. He really became the umpire, the arbiter of American democracy, American development as a nation. So this was the historic role. I didn't know, we don't know that he really wanted to claim more power to himself. He was not doing power politics. One thing sincere about John Marshall was that he wanted to arm the federal government with power so that there could be a strong republic born, American Democratic Republic born. That was his intention. And we all know there is an adage that twice makes a custom. If you succeed once, you can repeat your success second time, then people think this is the tradition. You must accept it. So John Marshall's style was that. He just used to float one decision and see what kind of objection was there. If that smoothly passed off, he would venture into a second similar decision in favor of federal government. And if it succeeded, then twice makes a custom, then this becomes part of law. It becomes a law of the land. And that was the nature of working of John Marshall at the Supreme Court. This was wonderful, the way he did.
In strict legal terms, judicial review means power of the supreme legal body of the land to interpret the law of the land. In the words of Marshall himself, it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. John Marshall was the founder of this ingenious piece of legal prescript. However, Marshall faced a lot of trouble before he could establish it as the legal norm of the land.
Initially there was a lot of opposition, but gradually judicial review became an accepted part of the Constitution, article of faith, we can say. It became an article of faith ultimately. So judicial review was established. Judicial review.
So here I want to ask you that was it successful in establishing judicial review, or were there setbacks also?
Well, for that we have to actually take up some cases of judicial review. And then in the balance sheet we'll see whether he succeeded or he failed. So at this stage, naturally, since you asked this question, I have to review some of the cases he handled of constitutional issues. The first case that he handled in 1803 was a case called Marbury versus Madison. Marbury was appointed by the previous Federalist government of John Adams. He was a Federalist. Federalists were opposed to Thomas Jefferson, under whom John Marshall served. Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican who had defeated the Federalists in the election of 1801. So it was absolutely necessary that some of the old die-hard Federalists should be removed from office. Marbury was one such appointment who had to be removed. He was the last of the Federalists to be removed. James Madison, who was appointed the Secretary of State at that time, means foreign minister. He was appointed. Now James Madison is also a very important thing. James Madison started as a Federalist, became a Democrat. Just the reverse. He was a staunch Federalist to start with, a friend of Alexander Hamilton, but he becomes a Democrat under the influence of both these persons, particularly under Thomas Jefferson, becomes his friend and succeeds him as the next president of the United States. He is a Democrat. Now, Thomas Jefferson asked Madison, his Secretary of State, to remove this obnoxious person, Marbury, from office. Madison did as he was told. He cooked up some ground and dismissed him. Naturally, Marbury went to the Supreme Court against this decision, executive decision. So that created the case Marbury versus Madison in 1803.
Marbury versus Madison is the first important case of Marshall's career in which the Supreme Court invalidated a provision of the Judiciary Act of 1789 on the grounds that it violated the Constitution by attempting to expand the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court.
In this case, John Marshall found that this was a very ticklish case. What to do? Because technically speaking, legally speaking, Marbury just couldn't be removed like that over partisan causes. At the same time, he had to support federal government. He wanted to support Thomas Jefferson and Madison. So he said that I am on a judicial review of the case, and said, on reviewing this case, I find that there is a prerogative of the president to remove some undesirable persons with whom he couldn't really work. So, from that point of view, he is justified. At the same time, he pointed out that the federal government, particularly the executive, should not indulge in this very frequently. The Supreme Court reserves the right to review such cases and ask this federal government to stop where they had gone into excesses. So this is a rare thing that they have exercised, which is condoned for the time being. They should not be made into practice, because you cannot take away somebody's job on the ground that he was not your party man. You couldn't do that. But sometimes one had to cross the bridge. Sometimes one had to remove such obnoxious persons. So he defended the executive, at the same time says executive must not go into excesses in doing this and destroy individual rights. So this is a typical case of judicial review. He was, he was balancing both federal rights and individual rights here, private rights here, and somehow he was giving the go to Jefferson's government, and Marbury had to leave the job. So in this way, since it was said to him as an arbiter, he took his stand in defense of the federal government, at the same time, in a way, defense of the individual rights, and made an adjustment and some compromise here. And this is the first deal. Then we find another case in 1810, which is known as Dartmouth College versus the trustees in the New York State. Now, Dartmouth College was run by a private autonomous body. The trustees were the main people who ran that college. But somehow the state legislature, they intervened in the management of this Dartmouth College and wanted to put some of their own men into the body, in the governing body of the college. Trustees objected to that. They thought that this was an interference into the autonomy of the management. So there was a tussle. The case came before the Supreme Court in 1810. John Marshall once again exercised what he called judicial review. And in this review said that, the college was a private property. Clearly, any college which was founded by autonomous means and money should be declared a private property. And the state government or the central government had no right to remove some persons and put in their own people there. It shouldn't be done. So in this case, verdict went in favor of the trustees, and the government, state government, was censured by John Marshall. They should not be done because it's a private property. It was doing good work. Dartmouth College, even today, is one of the celebrated colleges, and state government was interfering in its activities, and trustees had every right to be autonomous and choose their own people to run it successfully. Therefore, here he gave the verdict in favor of the trustees.
During the 1810s and 1820s, Marshall made a series of decisions involving the balance of power between the federal government and the states, where he repeatedly affirmed federal supremacy. For example, he established in McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, that states could not tax federal institutions, and upheld congressional authority to create the second bank of the United States, even though the authority to do this was not expressly stated in the Constitution.
In this case, the federal government wanted to establish a branch of the Federal Bank in Maryland. This was to be a national bank there, a branch of the national bank. Now, Maryland was a states rightist very strongly. They thought that this was an intervention in their affairs. Therefore, they strongly objected to the establishment of this branch. Now, John Marshall had to review once again. He was given the right of this case to review, and he reviewed and pointed out that, in the interest of the nation, the federal government could establish a branch of the National Bank of the United States. It could do that. But at the same time said, if Maryland objected to it vehemently, then it may be withdrawn. If the local people didn't want the federal bank to operate there at all, then the branch should be withdrawn. But he insisted that the principle, the right to establish a branch, was there. The federal bank has a right to establish a branch. But in this case, pragmatically speaking, since people were in opposition, they didn't want this kind of bank, okay, the bank could be withdrawn. So in this way, he made a compromise. So I am giving this illustration to show how his mind was playing to and fro and to, like that. All the time he was trying to balance the situation. We cannot say that he was a dogmatic federalist. We cannot say that. He was also a Democrat in many cases. So one has to appreciate the work of John Marshall in this way. And then further down, we have another case. This case is called Cohen versus Virginia in 1821. Now, in the state of Virginia, there was a state lottery run by some state agent, but there was a national lottery agent, who also wanted to do business there. He was Cohen's. Now, Cohen's wanted to float a national lottery in the state of Virginia, where already there was a state lottery system. That was a state right matter. But he was the national, this federal right. This case came up before him. He reviewed the case once again. And after going through pros and cons of this case, he said that, well, financial matters like this was a national question. You cannot restrict this kind of national funding process, because lottery, mostly for funding and development. So such development process through national funding by demanding state rights in financial matters all the time. Already he had a rebuff in that case, McCulloch, Maryland, where branch could not be established. Again, there was a national case where state was objecting. He said, no, Cohens should be allowed to run a federal lottery. And Virginia's objection was overruled. So see, he was both hot and cold. In the previous case, he was cold. Here he was hot. He asserted. And he said, no, Cohens could issue a lottery in the national interest. It was a federal agent. It could do that. So in this case, again, because it's a financial matter, and he thought that this fund would be utilized for national development. Say roadways, mostly road building, house building, etc. The lottery is generally utilized. And therefore, keeping everybody's profit, the main funding goes to some federal body who construct the roads or buildings or whatever, hospitals, etc. So here in this case we see that he was doing the reverse.
John Marshall in Cohen versus Virginia established that the federal judiciary could hear appeals from decisions of state courts in criminal cases as well as in civil cases, over which the court had asserted jurisdiction in Martin versus Hunter-Schlesy, 1816.
And then I refer to the last case. This case is called Gibbons versus Ogden. This case came up in 1824. In Gibbons versus Ogden, this was a fight between New Jersey and New York, two states, over the boating right on the Hudson River. Hudson River actually bisects the two states. It is a natural frontier between the two states. So both states and even federal agents, they wanted to run a steamship flotilla company on the Hudson, because many people, even today, they come from New York, work in New Jersey and go back in the evening, like our Howrah and Calcutta is something like that. So it always takes place. Therefore, they thought that this should be a national priority. And it came before John Marshall. John Marshall said, well, it's a national federal question. And it is in the interest of the nation, United States of America. It's not in the interest of New Jersey or New York. It is for the United States of America, all American people who ply through this route. And therefore, he said, no, the national operator should be allowed to operate here. That is Gibbons. In this way, he settled the question. And he was so forthright and aggressive in his arguments. And the way, you see, all the time he was harping on the same question, that it is in the interest of the American people, it is in the interest of the federal government, it is in the interest of the nation. And at the same time, in some cases we see he was also defending private rights. Like in the Dartmouth College versus Trustees, he was supporting private rights. Or McCulloch in Maryland, he had allowed Maryland to carry its point that no state branch of Bank of United States was necessary. So in some cases he was favoring states, in some cases he was favoring private property, in some cases he was supporting federal decisions, federal contractors, everything federal. After John Marshall came Roger B. Taney as the next Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But John Marshall was comparatively much more neutral than Taney. Taney was a friend of Andrew Jackson, the president from the West. And we find that the virus of the Southwest was carried by Roger B. Taney. He was more sectional than federal or national. So, if we compare John Marshall with Roger B. Taney, we would see that John Marshall really worked for national interest, whereas Taney worked for sectional interest much more than him.
Sir, what was Marshall's main goal behind the efforts that he made to uphold the federal constitution?
This question is very much debated among historians. Many people think that he was also championing Federalist rights, the agenda of the Federalist Party. He was for the wealthy people, propertied people, and he was also for accumulation of power in the hands of the already powerful. So he was doing all these decisions only to favor the plutocrats against the poor people. That is the allegation against him. And sometimes the allegation also to the other extreme, that he was a power monger himself. He was a power monger. So that is also a charge at personal level is also made. But my final judgment, before I conclude this lecture, is that if somebody really goes through the details of his life and till he finally died, one can give him the benefit of doubt. One can surely see through the pages of history, and one can see that he was not really for the plutocrats, not really only for the wealthy people. He was actually taking in his sweep both the rich and the poor people, the whole American nation, into his arms. This should not be lost sight of. And his final interest was to have a strong American nation, a strong American democracy. And for that he felt that in those stormy days of anarchy, that the hands of the federal government should be strengthened. Only from that conviction he had given many verdicts in favor of the federal government rather than state government. Wherever he failed, he also supported state rights or private rights all the time. Therefore, in the final analysis, this was his goal. There is nothing personal in this goal, nothing classist in this role. It was essentially John Marshall who emerges from the embers as a nationalist to the core.
The biographer Edward Baldwin has helped a lot of kudos on John Marshall. Even a critical person like Richard Hofstadter in the first book American Political Traditions and the Men Who Made It was rather caustic. But then he supported John Marshall in his great strides towards creating a strong center and also a powerful Supreme Court.